Hello everyone and welcome.
Ahem. Welcome to the Games Over Coffee podcast. This episode is normal. It has come to my attention that I do not introduce the hosts of the show. This is okay because as I said before, this episode is normal, and you already know who we are. But I suppose I could introduce myself to newer viewers. My name is
Yeah.
Whoops. Haha. Sorry. I have a bit of a cold. Anyway, today, Devon and I are talking about bad mechanics. I want to start this conversation with a quote from you. You've said before that there's no such thing as a bad mechanic.
Yeah.
You've said this when consulting for indie developers who put a mechanic into their game and are unsure if it fits.
Right. So when I say there's no such thing as a bad mechanic, what I mean is that there's no such thing as an inherently bad mechanic, because every mechanic can be good depending on the context. But on the other hand, every mechanic can also be bad depending on the context.
Let's take Mario Kart as an example. Let's say the player has the mechanic of instantly teleporting into first place. That would break the game, and thus be a bad mechanic.
Right. In that context, teleporting to first place would instantly kill any competition.
So how could that mechanic be good? That sounds like an inherently bad mechanic.
Well, in a racing context where the main idea is competition, then yeah, it's a bad mechanic. But think of what that mechanic is doing, right? It's just teleporting the player from one part of the map to another, and that's used all the time in other games like fast traveling.
Okay, let's say we have a mechanic of clipping through a wall. When would that mechanic be considered good?
Well, I think it'd be appropriate if it's leading the player to a goal of some sort. So, I don't know, let's say the player is going through a maze and then they use a power-up that lets them walk through walls, to create a shortcut. That wouldn't feel bad.
I see. So when you say bad mechanics, you mean inappropriate mechanics, like clipping through a wall in a cover-based shooter.
Exactly. The mechanics themselves are just tools that the game developer can use in any way. There's no good ones or bad ones, just appropriate and inappropriate.
I'm not sure I agree. For example, if I'm creating a platformer and I have a jumping mechanic, that's appropriate for the game, but tweaking the mechanic to be better won't make it more appropriate.
From my perspective, it does, because it depends on what you're trying to do with the game. In your case, making a platformer with your first jumping mechanic might seem like an appropriate thing to do. That is until you tweak it to make it better. I mean, you're basically discovering what type of jump is better suited for your game.
So when you say appropriate, you mean appropriate for the desired experience?
Yeah. The reason why I like to phrase it that way is because I think some people can get lost in the weeds about what's right and wrong for a specific game. There's some assumptions that certain mechanics are tied to specific games. Your gravity should be high if you're making a platformer, or your gun should have recoil if you're making a shooter. There's all these types of rules.
Those rules are good practices and guidelines, not laws.
No, yeah, I know, but to many beginning game developers, they might not know that. I could see them getting stuck making a game that they don't like simply because they're following all of the guidelines without really wanting to. Then they misunderstand why their game might not feel good.
Interesting. You're saying the beginner developer may not understand why those guidelines exist in the first place.
Exactly. I think this is also why tutorials can be bad for learning a skill. Sometimes tutorials can be good, for someone to just go through the motions when they're too overwhelmed to do it by themselves. But following too closely can make the learner do things without understanding why.
Do people always need to understand why they're doing something in order to learn it?
I'd say that learning is coming to understand why you're doing something, yeah.
I wouldn't say so. I'd say learning is understanding how to do something, not necessarily why.
Okay, that's fair, yeah, but I think in order to truly create things that you want to create, you have to know why you're doing it.
What about art? A lot of artists create without the intent ever being in their mind. They simply follow their intuition.
Yeah, but following that intuition is still a form of understanding why you're doing it. Like, you might not be able to explain every motivation, but you can broadly explain that you're following what you think feels good to do.
So you're saying that using best practices and tutorials end up blinding the developer from their intuition?
Kinda. I'm saying that if someone strictly emulates the way that others do things, then they'll never get a chance to create from their heart. They'll only be able to replicate.
And that's why you say there's no such thing as a bad mechanic? Because if a mechanic is seen as bad, then a beginner developer may never see it as a tool, but rather as a hindrance.
Yes.
Isn't it a good thing to at least understand the basics before making anything you want? A beginner dev might make a game that has weak game juice, bad gameplay, and terrible feedback.
Well, yes, it's good to understand the basics. All I'm getting at is that a beginning game developer shouldn't put too much stock in bad mechanics. And really, that's up to the teacher to explain.
The way I've seen teachers explain good practices is once you understand the rules, you can break them.
Yeah, I'd say that's an okay way of saying it. I never really liked that idea because it makes it seem as if you have to be a specific experience level to experiment. I think a better way of saying it is to simply say that these things are common practices and explain why many people do it that way, but also that they're not strict rules. Like, there was this one thing that happened to me while I was learning to code in C# where there was this constant frustration when I didn't know what specific method to do for a specific thing. I learned how to do things like print text and change values, but I seemed to hit a wall when I tried to do something, conceptually simple like move a character. I didn't understand what I was supposed to do to make that happen. It wasn't until I looked up a whole lot of tutorials that I realized that what I wanted was abstract and there wasn't really one way of moving the character. What I observed was many different ways of doing it. Had I known that at the beginning of my journey, it would have made my learning experience a lot better.
I think that's what classes are for.
Yeah, during that time of my life, I was teaching myself, so a class definitely would have helped.
A shorter episode today, but nonetheless thoughtful. Thank you for listening to this very normal episode. Disregard any mistakes that were made during the introduction.